Hello and welcome to Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I'm going to be talking about plot and plot structures. Yay, exciting. And the reason I like this is obviously I like a lot of the structural approaches. I like stripping away a lot of the prose, the style, all of these different elements to get to the actual events that happen, because that can reveal a lot about how the book functions or how the story or narrative is functioning. But also we can use it on a micro scale, and we can look at little small events or small groupings and strip away how the narrative is telling us about these things, why the narrative is telling us these things in that particular way, and look at the specific bones of it, because then we can compare it to other things and then add back in all of that detail. And then when we compare them, we can see how the narrator shaded or colored or played with our expectations, manipulated us, did all of these things. And for me, that's absolutely fascinating. But I know for the majority of you, that's not what you do when you read. So why talk about plot? Well, first of all, plot, as I've said before, are the narrative events as relayed to, as narrated to, as told to, as shown to us, the reader, us, the viewer, us, the narratee. And so as long as there are narrative events, as in things that happen, that means that there's plot. Now, one of the ways of refining this definition or developing it in a slightly different way is to talk about plot as having these events with a causal link, that they have to be linked together. And again, as a general guiding principle, that's not a bad one, but it's not a hard and fast rule, because like all of these things that I'm discussing, almost always there's at least one exception. And in terms of causal links between narrative events, if you have a mosaic novel, or if you have a collection of short stories within a frame narrative, sometimes called a fix-up, that can actually create plot, even though there's no causal link between the individual instances. But there's still an overall plot for the narrative. That's why the frame narrative is in place, and that's why it's been organized in a specific way. So we can still refer to it as having a plot. We also have a lot of the modernists and postmodernists who played around with what you can actually do with narrative and tried to construct engaging stories that didn't have a plot. They didn't have any narrative events. It was just two people talking. That's it. Nothing actually happens. It is literally just two people talking. They don't move around. They don't get things. It's just them talking. No narrative events occur. And again, it's incredibly rare, because the vast majority of novels, the vast majority of books, the vast majority of films are not these literary or narrative experiments. The vast majority of them have a plot. So it is very, very rare that you will ever read anything and you go, that had no plot. So what is a plot structure? And this is when we get into something that sometimes we can misunderstand. A plot structure, we can view it from one of two perspectives. We can view it from an authorial perspective, or we can view it from a reading, consuming perspective. So let's take it from an authorial perspective just for a second. Authors can use plot structures to help structure their narrative. And I say plot structures. There's more than one. There are lots of different structures that can be used. There is no, this is the plot structure. It's, this is a plot structure. And even then, an author can take that plot structure, and once it's there, sort of go, well, now I'm going to change this bit, and now I'm going to change this bit, and now I'm going to invert that, and now I'm going to add in, oh, a bit from this plot structure, I'm going to add that in there. How does that all fit out? Because what plot structures are the bones within a narrative that show general trends and movements of the narrative events, usually for creating specific effects. And when a plot structure is very, very common, that's when we have that We know a book is building to a certain climax at a certain point, and we know it's going to happen roughly around here. You see this most strongly in a lot of Hollywood blockbuster movies where they are working to the same plot structure. One of the most prevalent ones in Hollywood is called Save the Cat, which is essentially a distillation and slight reworking of Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, mixed with a little bit of Freytag to create a sheet that basically times out when you have these specific story beats. And once you're aware of what that pattern is, it is very surprising and incredibly disheartening to see the number of films that fall exactly into that narrative style. But we should never fall into the perception that that is how it should be done. That is one way it can be done. So what are these plot structures? And I mentioned one of them there, which is Freytag's pyramid or Freytag's triangle. And this is one of the most common ones that gets wheeled out. If you've done any course in creative writing, if you've Googled for 5 minutes, you will have come across this. And it's introduction and exposition that leads to a rising action, usually with a major event at some point in it, which is related to it and develops, to a climax, which is linked to that instigating event. The climax is resolved, so there's then falling action, which then brings you down to the conclusion or the denouement, where it resets the sort of world and it leaves you off in contrast to where you started. So what that basically means is the exposition or the introduction sets up who the characters are, what the world is, what the setting is, what the general frame is. When you get to the rising action, there is a problem, an issue, an instigating event that sets up what the big conflict is going to be, what the problem that's going to be resolved is going to be. Then you have a hero's journey along that line of various incidents that occur as they work towards the climax, the resolution of that initial event. They get to the climax, something happens, and we then have falling action, the result of the climax, what has happened, and that leads to the denouement, which is a comparison or contrast to how we began, because it then basically readdresses where the characters are now, where the world is now, and how the world has changed. And you go, there you go, the plot pyramid, Freytag's triangle. Very straightforward, and if you think about it, very, very generalized, because this is not telling you plots must do this. This is a 19th century German saying, I have noticed this general trend, but this has nothing about dialogue and scenes and how many specific incidents should occur and how many different characters there are and how many different plot lines should be interwoven. Can you have flashbacks or an ellipsis? Freytag's triangle doesn't pay attention to that. It's looking at a general trend of how the structure works within a lot of different novels. And it was created in the 19th century. It is not a blueprint for understanding plot. It is one technique to show that start at the beginning at here, explain everything to your reader, then slowly build to this point, then have something happen, and then tell the reader what happened. If you think, maybe you're aware of this, have you ever heard of the 5-paragraph essay, where introduction, that addresses the thesis statement. Paragraph 1, 2, and 3 are the 3 main points that address and answer and explore the thesis statement. Paragraph 5 is your conclusion. End of essay. Is that the only way to write an essay? No. It is an essay structure. It explains basic principles. But once you've mastered the basic principles, then you play variations on a theme. Then you explore different ways of doing it. And Freytag's triangle is just one approach to understanding how plot functions. Because we can look at a slightly different narrative approach, which again starts with an introduction in this sort of exposition that sets up who the characters are and what the characters are doing and the world in which they are situated, what their situation is. And then something happens. There's an instigating event. And we then follow the character and the repercussions of that event on them. And that follows a transition to perhaps making their world better, their situation better. And then there is a turn or a twist. And what happens is they misunderstood or they were misinformed about that first event, and their world comes tumbling down. And so we then have the resolution and the denouement, where we see that they end up in a different position. The world has changed, the character has changed, but it hasn't followed the same structure as the plot pyramid, because it's not about that structure. It's about having a twist in the middle of it that creates an unexpected result. So if you were expecting Freytag's pattern, you would be very disappointed or very surprised when they use this other pattern. And yet that's a very well-established pattern. If you think about what happens in terms of detective fiction, there's an instigating event. Then we get the detective being introduced to solve the murder. We don't always have a whole introduction about who all of these different people are and what's going on. Sometimes the story starts with the detective arriving at a murder, and we then follow the detective as they're trying to piece things together. Then there's usually a twist or a reveal, which leads to a conclusion and solving the mystery. Again, that doesn't follow Freytag. It doesn't even follow the other one that I was talking about. It's slightly different. If we think of Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, he designed that by taking a whole load of folk tales, a whole load of folk narratives and fairy tales, stripping away anything that made them unique and looking for key aspects, and designed the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is actually a circular narrative. So unlike the plot pyramid or the plot triangle from Freytag, this is actually the hero starts at one position. There's a call to adventure. There are various incidents that occur along the way. There are things that the hero will fail at. There are trials and ordeals that the hero has to pass. There are various helpers and items given to him over time and at certain periods for maximum effect. And then there is a resolution of the major instigating factor, which leaves the hero changed. The hero then has to return home, and we see the hero and the world changed at the end, and then it resets for the hero to go on the next adventure. And it's a circular narrative structure. It's a circular plot structure. When we think of tragedies, tragedies can follow a quite typical example would be the characters in the world are introduced and they are here at this kind of level. Then, as the narrative progresses, their world gets better and everything seems to be going really well for them, until something happens that's absolutely devastating and their world falls apart and everything is bad. And basically, it forms an unhappy smiley face. That's it. That's tragedy. But if we think of a comedy in terms of dramatic comedy, not comedy, ha ha ha, but a dramatic comedy, where we start at the beginning, things go wrong for a lot of the characters and it sort of descends until there's this big event that occurs where suddenly things turn around and everything works out and the characters end up better than they were when they started. Everything is resolved nicely and you get a smiley face comedy. Completely different structure. It's a different way of thinking about how the different events work. But even within all of these things, we could take Freytag's pyramid, Freytag's triangle, and we could run a whole load of them together to form mini incidents all the way through a narrative and put it inside a tragedy. We can use all of these different structures in different ways, because let's think about this for a second. When we have a standalone novel, does that, or should that, if you want to use those terms, function the same way that a trilogy should? So book 1, book 2, book 3, should all 3 books in a trilogy all have exactly the same structure. And should that structure for each one of them be exactly the same as the structure for a standalone? And what if it's not a trilogy, but an ongoing series? Should all of them have exactly the same structure? And if they always had exactly the same structure, would it be enjoyable? Would we like to see variations on a theme? And this is where we get into subversion. If there's an expectation that a structure is going to go in a certain direction, an author can alter that to create a completely different effect because we've lulled ourselves into believing it is going to go in one direction, and the author goes, haha, it's going in a different direction. And they create that effect. When we have serial narratives, it's quite often we get lots of mini peaks for each individual episode because they are trying in a serial narrative not to change what Freytag would call the introduction or the exposition and the denouement too much, because a serial narrative has to keep going. And if you radically change those positions, then you're constantly having to escalate the levels of threat and you're having to change those things. But in a series narrative, we could have a narrative arc across the whole of the series, which could follow something like Freytag's triangle. But if the series narrative is following Freytag's triangle, then how can we reflect that in the different episodes that make up the series? So if you have a 7-book series and you're trying to replicate Freytag's structure across the series, then that means certain books are going to be part of that triangle and not reflect the whole triangle. So again, trying to understand and map plot structures onto novels is generally not as useful as trying to understand what the plot is actually doing. And when you strip away a lot of the narrative elements like the prose and the description and the characterization and the narrative perspective, and you look just at the events, that can give you an idea of what is happening in a novel. And then you can draw lines and try and connect things up and see the transitions. And you would come up with a model for what that one particular novel was doing. And if you then smooth out some of those lines and zoom out a wee bit, then you might find a plot structure that's already been identified that novel kind of fits into. But to do that, you are ignoring all of those elements that make that novel unique. Because narrative is not just plot. Narrative is not just characterization. Narrative is not just the prose or the point of view or the narrative perspective. Narrative is all of these things working together. So plot, the sequence of narrative events is narrated to the narratee. Yes, we can use different structures to summarize what the plot is doing, but those structures are not plot. Plot is the sequence of narrative events. The structures are describing the plot. And if a plot doesn't follow that structure, it doesn't mean that there's no plot. It just means it's following a different structure. So that's a brief rundown of plot structures, narrative structures, whatever you want to call them. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one.